Thank you, Professor.
Thank you, Sharad. Tuanku, colleagues, compatriots, friends all, peace be upon you. I think that is more credible now that I have left ISIS. The discussion today is a rather difficult one. I think the question can legitimately be asked, why are we here talking about income inequality when income inequality, as we heard from Alan and his colleagues, has actually declined apparently in Malaysia in the recent period? Well, I think there are many reasons for us to be concerned about it, but very importantly, as we were reminded, the commitment to national unity and to achieve that through reducing poverty and restructuring society was something which was recognized almost half a century ago. Unfortunately, the institutions which fed on that have resulted in what is essentially been an ethno-populist political and policy discourse for the last half century. And this, I think, is a fundamental problem which we have, and it is a fundamental problem in addressing what Tan Sri Andrew described as the effort to try to develop a new social compact, which is absolutely essential if we are to deal with the challenges of our age. Now, I think it is generally well known that income inequality in Malaysia is apparently down, has been declining at least after the 1970s. Although I would remind you that the numbers which we have been looking at are actually not strictly comparable, because the first household income survey which was actually conducted in Malaysia was for 1984. So for 1970, we have the post-evaluation survey, and then for 73, we actually have an expenditure survey. For 76, we have the agricultural census, and for 79, we actually were using something else very different. So the apparent spike in inequality during the late 1970s, which you saw in Alan's presentation before lunch, is actually perhaps due to the fact that we were using very, very different numbers. I have argued in other fora that the 1970s was an unusual period, a period characterized by reduced inequality, but high growth. The apparent trade-off, which is often posited, that there's a trade-off between growth and inequality, is actually not borne out by Malaysian experience. Now, of course, as you also know, we have had greater and greater interest in a number of other issues, and I think it's important for us to recognize this. Now, in Malaysia, we have, according to the Human Resources Minister, about 6.7 million foreign workers in the country. 2.2 million are documented, are acknowledged, leaving another 4.5 million. Okay, now when you consider that the size of the Malaysian labor force is 15 million, and you deduct 2.2 million, leaving about 13 million, 6.7 million is actually about a third of the labor force. If those estimates are on the low side, the number becomes very different. Now, if you consider that 4.5 million are not documented, according to riot figures, then there's a huge underclass which we're not even taking into consideration. So once you don't take them into consideration, we may well be underestimating inequality on grounds other than the grounds which we have been discussing so far. Yet another issue, of course, is that wealth inequality is, of course, very different. And we probably have very poor estimates of wealth inequality in this country for a variety of reasons. But as we are reminded annually during this time of the year, before the World Economic Forum, before Davos, the degree of concentration of wealth has been going up by leaps and bounds. In Malaysia, the nearest we have in the recent times is what this listing of so-called Bursa billionaires. And Bursa billionaire list is actually quite interesting. But what is also interesting are the number of very rich people who are not even there on the Bursa billionaires list. Okay? So for instance, the man who is often listed by Forbes as the richest Malaysian, Robert Kwok, is not to be found on that list, and so on and so forth. Now, wealth which is held abroad, which is not held through the, on companies listed in the KL Stock Exchange, is also not captured by this. So we actually have a significant underestimation by relying on BSKL data. So my own belief, and I think this is supported by the two previous presentations this morning, is that we have increasing wealth concentration in this country for a whole variety of reasons, which is not necessarily always reflected in terms of income. Some of you may remember that about a quarter of a century ago, there was a report that about half the people in the country who own luxury cars were not even paying income tax. Okay? So, you know, this is an indication of the degree of underreporting and underestimation. Now, what we see from Alan Ng's excellent presentation earlier today, and I would also refer you to his paper together with some KRI colleagues to the Bank Negara conference at the end of last year, is that labor shares in Malaysia have been increasing. Okay? Now, labor shares may be increasing, but we have an underestimation of the size of the labor force for reasons which I mentioned earlier. But what is also very important, I think, is for us to consider that his very important observation that there has been a significant shift to what are called traditional services. Traditional services, and so the country has been experiencing deindustrialization for the last 2 decades, and we are shifting not to modern services, but rather to traditional services. So I think we have a very serious problem on our hands, and I think this is something which is very important for us to begin to recognize. The other point I think for us to take account of is his very important observation of the apparent disparity between incomes from income surveys and incomes as suggested by the national income data. So how do we understand this disparity? There are many different challenges involved here, and I don't have time to get into that now, but I think it's very important to make a mental note of this very important point. The point I want to make here is that contrary to the question in the last session about strong FDI, the figures for FDI are not as terribly strong, except perhaps in the recent reporting. But what is very important for us to recognize is that we have not seen any estimates of foreign ownership of the stock exchange. The last reported data from the plan documents is for 2008. So for the last decade, we have had no reporting of who owns the Malaysian economy. And for reasons which we heard from Professor Jayadev in the first session, we have, and I think some other commentators as well, we have, Tan Sri Andrew, we have very cheap capital available for those who can borrow. And so there has been a strong, and especially with the declining ringgit, it was possible for people from abroad to buy into our stock in the Malaysian Stock Exchange because it was relatively cheap. And so you have had, it is very likely, significantly increased. Now, the reason for mentioning this is because if you remember the new economic policy when it began, the whole idea was that Malaysian ownership of shares would actually significantly increase. And what we have seen in the last decade or perhaps more has been a resurgence of foreign portfolio investments, FPI, as opposed to foreign direct investments which don't figure in the stock exchange. So basically what we therefore have is a situation where it is very likely that the last point I'd like to make is that the post-fiscal redistribution, Professor Kanbor talked about tax and transfer, and I would like to emphasize that, as Professor Ismail Saleh pointed out, the late Ismail Saleh pointed out many, many years ago, we do not have a progressive tax structure. The incidence of taxation is actually regressive in Malaysia. It's regressive for all kinds of reasons, and I would argue that it has become more regressive over time, particularly the reforms of 1985 and subsequently, and then more recently with the introduction of the GST in particular. Because the GST basically taxes in ways in a much more regressive fashion, because in the SST before that did not tax the poorest, but now everybody is taxed, and this I think is a significant shift in the fiscal. Now on the expenditure side as well, Dr. Wee didn't talk about this today, but she has shown that the fiscal system, both on the tax side as well as on the expenditure side, is not especially progressive. So I think we should get away from this presumption that, you know, that we have a tax and transfer system which is addressing income distribution in a progressive fashion. Now, I don't have time to elaborate on this, but I think it is useful to think about the policy context very, very quickly in terms of the leadership. I would combine the second and third prime minister because during the 1970s, because they had much in common. And I think it's also important to distinguish between three phases of Tun Mahathir's tenure, very long tenure of 22 plus years. There are three phases. The first phase, the first half decade of heavy industries and looking east, he gives up on that from around 1986. The liberalization, partial liberalization on both the economic front, but also on the cultural front, educational policies and so on and so forth, privatization, and then very happily for Malaysia and some of the other Southeast Asian economies, Indonesia and Thailand, you have a second round of export-oriented industrialization with the transfer of industries from Northeast Asia into Southeast Asia as well as China. And then we have the subsequent phases which can be distinguished. I won't get into them right now, but basically what you have is a fairly impressive increase in growth over in the size of the economy over time, and this I think is very important. But I think it's also very important to remind ourselves about how volatile some of this has been. Now on balance we have done pretty well, as the last graph showed, but the volatility basically reminds us some of the consequences of having a very, very open economy. Open not only in terms of trade, which we all know from growing up, but more recently, we have been much, much more vulnerable to openness on the financial front as well. Now, just a reminder that where am I supposed to point this? Okay. Just a reminder that we have reached the peak of manufacturing about 2 decades ago, and also to remind ourselves that our educational attainments seem to be very, very impressive, but that the workforce skills seem to be inadequate. So there is obviously what people politely call a mismatch, and there are some concerns around that, which I won't get into right now. Now, the changing nature of the Malaysian economy has been quite dramatic, and I will just run through a number of slides to emphasize that the changing nature of employment is important, and this I think, again referring to the labor share of income, the fact, as Dr. Wee also pointed out, that you have a very significantly, more and more people are wage earners, you know, going from about half at 1970 to about 3/4 at present. And the number in manufacturing has significantly gone down to about 17%. Now, This is the table which basically shows you the significant changes. I mentioned this, I mentioned half earlier, mainly because the figures for 1957 are basically only for Peninsular Malaysia. Now, the official numbers basically suggest, confirm the story which we heard earlier, that income distribution seems to have been improving. So we have a very important situation of significant progress in terms of poverty reduction, as well as apparently a declining Gini ratio. And poverty is really pretty much almost a non-issue these days. Very impressive achievements on this, notwithstanding some of the concerns which Dr. Dennison and Dr. Wee reminded us of in the last session. The change in occupations has also been very dramatic in the country, and it's useful for us to remind ourselves of this. And very significantly, since I think the discourse of the last half century has been about inter-ethnic differences, to remind ourselves of that there has been a dramatic decline in the differences between average Chinese income and average Malay income, as well as a decline in urban-rural differences. Now, moving very quickly to questions of wealth ownership, it is important to recognize that we are always concerned about the Bumiputra ownership, and understandably so. I think it's important to recognize that most of this Bumiputra ownership, I mean, all these numbers are really at par value, okay, rather than at market value. And so there is probably an underestimation of the value of some of the better shares, and this is obviously not distributed equally among the different ethnic groups. Now, I think very importantly also, particularly with the privatization thrust from the mid-1980s, we have seen a significant transfer of wealth from what we'll call Bumiputra trust agencies to private individuals. So there are quite a number of wealthy Bumiputras, but what this has meant in terms of entrepreneurship or otherwise is a matter of some concern. Now, I think the point the picture which emerges is that there has been a rising tide of economic growth, and most boats have been lifted by this rising tide. Most people are much better off than let us say, 2 generations ago. But what does all this actually mean? Well, there has been a significant improvements in life expectancy. The average life expectancy currently is about 75, I think, averaging for men and women. Women live much longer than men, and compared to about 62 in 1970. And so on and so forth. But I think it's important for us to be reminded by a point which Hisham from the EPF reminded us of earlier, and in his own work, where we find that 4/5 of EPF members and only half of the labor force are actually members of the EPF. Half the Malaysian labor force are actually members of the EPF. Only 4/5 of them have actually, at the end of their lives, or at least at the age of 55, have enough savings to receive an income above the poverty line. Okay, in other words, 82%. Okay, now that surely must be a matter of concern. Malaysians are also among the most highly indebted in the world. Very good in terms of financial inclusion, but let us not forget that heavy indebtedness has risks. And if you take, for example, a concern in India, there's a very good, fine investigative journalist named Sainath who demonstrated that over 300,000 Indian farmers have basically taken their own lives because of the very nature of the debt bonds and so on and so forth. I need not remind you of some of the other problems which poor people face with alongs and various other phenomena of contemporary society. So are households better off in the recent period? My own hunch is that between 2012 and 2014, conditions did improve, and the KRI state of households for 2012 and 2014 attests to that. And I suspect that two things really helped. One is high commodity prices in 2014 compared to 2012. And another thing another factor which helped a great deal was the introduction of the minimum wage from 2013. That too probably helped. And related to that, of course, was the extension of the reach of social protection in the form of BRIM. Okay? But from 2014 to the present, the story changes, partly because of the impact of GST, the withdrawal of some subsidies. Some subsidies, I'm sure many of us would quite happy to celebrate the removal of, but some subsidies obviously affected people. Professor Manan and I are working on questions of nutrition, and we are not terribly pleased about the subsidy for sugar, for instance, which has contributed to Malaysians having the highest incidence of diabetes in Asia, or the incidence of obesity. Malaysians are also among the most obese in continental Asia, and so on. But having said that, I think there is apparently, both on the tax side as well as on the expenditure side, a shift in the direction of regressivity. And considering the undercounting of foreign labor, this affects us. It affects our understanding of incomes. It affects our understanding of productivity, of labor productivity and other productivity measures. It fundamentally affects us in very, very profound ways. And this is why I think we have to come to grips with the question of foreign labor. Many of the other points have already been made by other speakers, and I will not reiterate them. And I will just, it's also useful for us to remind ourselves of the point which I made earlier, which about the EPF numbers, where only 18% have enough savings to have incomes above the poverty line after. So this obviously has very profound implications. Now, let me just share with you some numbers on fiscal revenue, the shift, big increase in taxation through the GST. And I would just remind you that when VAT was first introduced in many countries, the UK, in Japan, and other countries, it usually is introduced at a very low level, but the system is what counts. And so once the system is accepted, governments of the day can easily move the level up. So there is obviously going to be a shift with less and less reliance on income tax and greater reliance on GST in the future. So the implications of this obviously are quite considerable. Now, it's useful for us also to think about the support on the expenditure side, what has happened. And as I suggested earlier, subsidies and social assistance has come down in quite significantly, and obviously as a share of household expenditure, let us assume that that the two are comparable. Of course, they are not strictly comparable. Obviously, the impact is quite significant. So, on the expenditure side, you have less, about 7%, and it's equivalent to about, grosso modo, it is equivalent to about 7% of household expenditure. So not insignificant. So, basically, the argument is that both the primary distribution, which Tan Sri Azman correctly emphasized in his intervention from the floor in the earlier session, both on the primary distribution is problematic because we do not know the real numbers, because we ignore probably about 5 million undocumented foreign workers, and on the tax as well as the expenditure side, which have been regressive and become even more regressive over time. We do not have a terribly pretty picture. And this, I think, is a matter of some concern. Now, as you know, there has been a significant increase in the budget deficit is not a small amount. It's 17% of the total budget. But my greater concern is that more and more spending by government is off budget. Okay, you have what are called government guaranteed loans. And the most dramatic example, of course, is the ECRL, which just began at the beginning of this month. And you have huge loans which are guaranteed by government but not borne by government. And these will also need to be paid at some point. And this, of course, has very important implications going forward. So there are significant concerns about budgetary principles, which I will not get into right now. And I think it's also important for us to think about why there is a declining credibility of our inflation numbers. I'll just mention two. The exchange rate went from about 3.2 against the US dollar to 4.4 something at its lowest, and then has picked up and is slightly under 4 at this stage. Still, a fairly 20% decline if you consider it today compared to 3 years ago, 20% decline. And yet, it does not seem to have even had a blip on our inflation numbers. Yet another factor, of course, is the imposition of a 6% GST. Now, the reason why it is important for us to think about the GST imposition is that it basically involves, as I showed earlier, a doubling of consumption tax, okay? But very significantly, a doubling where it was us, the middle class, who used to pay consumption SST, okay? You go to a restaurant, you pay SST, etc., etc. But now, it is the poor, okay? So you have a very, very significant shift in the tax burden, but very importantly for our purposes, you have an additional equivalent to about 3%, okay, increase in living costs. And yet it is not reflected in our inflation numbers. So this is why I think many people ask very, very legitimate and difficult questions about are our inflation numbers reliable. I think finally sort of anticipating some of the questions about what can be done in these very challenging circumstances, I think it's useful for us to think about these issues. Having more skills and productivity does not necessarily reflect, we all learn in our basic economics that, the wage is supposed to be equivalent to marginal productivity. The trick is marginal productivity, okay? So the key point is really that has got nothing to do with average productivity, okay? So there is no automatic mechanism, except perhaps where you have strong bargaining power of labor, for there to be an adjustment, a commensurate adjustment. And in fact, the institutions work against it. In Malaysia, for example, there's an industrial court ruling that a wage increase should never be more than 2/3 of the productivity increase. In other words, 1/3 automatically goes to capital, regardless of who is responsible. And in earlier work, we have showed that, that real wages have actually gone down significantly and even when productivity has more than doubled in the case of plantation workers during the 1960s, for instance. And so you find that they are very difficult, it is extremely difficult to guarantee that higher skills will actually ensure this. But very troubling for us is that if you have the easy option of cheap, undocumented foreign labor, there is very little incentive on the part of employers to adopt higher productivity, technical change. And this, I think, is a very, very major consideration. So some of you are old enough to remember that 3 decades ago, we were all talking about how to mechanize oil palm harvesting and so on, oil palm fruit harvesting and so on and so forth. But very little has actually been done in the interim. Likewise, it's useful for us to, you've already been reminded about how the EPF system today is not adequate for the vast majority of workers. We also find that, but minimum wage policy, I would suggest, has had some effect. And I think it's also important to remember that a very important consideration, of course, is antitrust policy. And antitrust policy in this country is virtually non-existent. And you will find that many of the libertarians, economic liberals who talk so much about price competition and so on and so forth, are quite happy to reconcile themselves to monopolies. Because for them, as with Milton Friedman, but not Friedrich Hayek, for them, the achievement of a monopoly is basically is a reflection of the success of the enterprise, and not something to be wary of. So we are living in a situation comparable to the situation a long time ago, and this problem is compounded by the fact that we are quite open on our as far as foreign goods are concerned. Now you find that the worst area is precisely in the area of food. For many imported foods, we have virtual monopolies or duopolies or oligopolies, and this is a matter of grave concern. What was once a public monopoly for completely justifiable reasons has become a private monopoly in the case of rice marketing, for instance. So these are matters of concern. It has become legitimate to have a private monopoly in this country in a number of areas. Also, I'm concerned about the deindustrialization because, as many people correctly observe, we have had a premature deindustrialization, and it's also very important to recognize that there has been a virtual abandonment of industrial policy in this connection. We are not doing enough about international tax cooperation, even, say, within ASEAN. So if we have a neighbor, for example, which is a tax haven, there is nothing to deter rich corporations from migrating south of, I won't say where, but and taking advantage of that. So you can have a significant situation where we are actually going to miss quite a bit of the potential tax which the country should be able to collect. This will obviously compromise and fetter social policies, and the likelihood that we will be able to extend social protections to meet some of the challenges in the time ahead will be importantly compromised. So I think we have a very, very major challenge. We need to respond to what Tan Sri Andrew suggested at the outset. We need to begin to think about how we can truly unite in order to deal with the challenges which we face as a country as we try to move ahead further into the 21st century. Thank you very much for your attention.